Good evening. Welcome back to the Deep 404. To summarise what's happened in the last day or so in Ukraine, I think would be to say that we are reaching a turning point. It seems as though the Ukrainian offensive has reached its high point and is starting to roll back from there. Across all the regions on the front line, from Kupiansk in the north down to Krasny Liman and then to the Donetsk region, through southern Donetsk to Zaporozhye and then Kherson, we're seeing what appears to be a decrease in activity. Now, there's still fighting going on, of course. There's still heavy fighting going on in areas and contested areas, but the number of attacks being launched by the Ukrainians, the number of casualties, Ukrainian casualties being reported by the Russian Ministry of Defense, is certainly declining. And there are a number of reports over the last 24 hours which give the indication that the Russian forces are gaining the upper hand at the moment. Areas, for example, in the Donetsk region, just outside Artemovsk, the Ukrainians call Bakhmut, the Oerkhovo-Vasilevka township. There are reports now that Russia has taken control over that small township there. Reports that the Russian counterattacks have started throughout southern areas in Zaporozhye and South Donetsk. Of particular interest in the area of Verbovoy. Verbovoy, just to the east, about 12 kilometers to the east of Robotne, which is south of Oerkhovo in the Zaporozhye region. This has been the area where we have seen the sustained Ukrainian push and attempt to get down to the Sea of Azov. The reported Ukrainian losses have decreased to a much lower number than we've seen for some time. And now reports of counterattacks occurring from the Russians. There are reports that the Russians are also now counterattacking and capturing strong points in the South Donetsk area near Urozhanoye, in the Verbovoy ledge. The Ukrainians have been pushing down there to through Staromayorsk and Urozhanoye, just to the west of there, Priutne. Now, in all of those areas, there are reports coming out now that the Russians are starting to consolidate or make counteroffensives and starting to capture some areas. Also reports even in the north Kupiansk area near Sinkovka up the top there, that there have been again some successful Russian counteroffensives made in those areas. So across the line, and I will at the end of this report get to the breakdown from the Russian Ministry of Defense and the details, but in summary, it seems as though the Ukrainian offensive has spent itself. There are still reports of activity in the Kherson region around the islands in Kherson, but at this stage, no firm evidence of the Ukrainians being able to mount an attack. Russian reporting on Telegram channels that I have read gives the indication that they are confident that they are monitoring the area well. I've seen video today of a number of bomb strikes. I'd imagine these are large fab bomb, 500 bomb strikes in the Kherson area, destroying command centers, groupings of forces. So while there may be a push there may still be a push from the Ukrainians through the Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, at this stage, the Russian feeling about that is that they sense that they have that under control and are continuing to continuing to diminish the Ukrainian forces on the west bank of the Dnieper in the Kherson region, and being able to kind of control them and contain them in that area. We'll see in the coming days, I suppose, before we get into the wet season, if the Ukrainians do have forces there and are able to make some sort of an attack. I just want to talk a little bit now, just a little bit on the topic of missiles. So, again, Simplicius the Thinker has done another great article, and I just want to cover a couple of the points that he's mentioned in there. He talks about the attacks, the recent attacks on Crimea and on the ports of Sevastopol. And I'll get down into those in just a moment, but a little bit on missiles there, and why that area of Crimea is an area which is being attacked by the Ukrainians at the moment. Now, one of the reasons is that the ports there in Sevastopol are on the edge of the land, so they don't have vast expanses of land in front of them upon which layered air defence systems can be set up. With your air defence, you like to cover regions and have them overlapping, and have communication between those air defence systems. Now, once you've got a port, and on the seaward side of the port is the ocean, you have a challenge there where you're not able to have layered defences in front of you. And this seems to be one of the reasons why the Ukrainian Storm Shadow and cruise missile, Scalp missile attacks through the Crimea have been relatively successful over the last month. The logic is that because those cruise missiles are ones which are able to take confusing circuitous paths, they can fly very low if required. They're able to scoot along water at low levels and effectively avoid radar detection to some extent until they get very close. Now, once they're very close and they're detected, that's when you run into challenges with your air defence, because you just don't have time to intercept them. Now, if you have layered air defence, which you can easily do over the ground, even if the first layer of air defence is not able to intercept an incoming cruise missile, it may be able to detect it, may even be able to identify it, and then pass that information back to the second and third layers of air defence. They are then given a heads up as to what to look for and where to look and how to prime themselves for that particular target. And so those layered defences make your air defence more successful overall. So that seems to be part of the issue why we've seen these successful attacks of cruise missiles in the Crimea area. This also has an impact on front line areas. So on the front line, if as the front line moves, so in this conflict, let's just say the Russians begin pushing westwards, as that front line is moving, for the Ukrainian air defence, anywhere behind the Russian front line is effectively like the water in the scenario I've just given. The Ukrainians aren't able to put their front air defences, those first layers, out there because it's now Russian territory. So as you approach areas like airfields, as the front line approaches areas like that, those airfields become susceptible. And we've seen examples of this in the last few days with a MiG-29 destroyed at Ukraine's Donetsk air base in Kryvyi Rog. It's not far from the Russian positions near Energodar, near the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. But this Donetsk air base hasn't been the only one. The Bolshaya Kharkovka airfield in Kremenchug is said to have been extensively damaged, and the Starokonstantinov in Khmelnytsky air base has been hit a number of times, and it's one which houses, has been the primary housing of the majority of Ukraine's Su-24s. Now, the Su-24s are those aircraft which have been modified so that they can carry Storm Shadow and, I presume, Scalp missiles. So these these missiles, these cruise missiles, are difficult for air defence to address because of their ability to change paths. Now, I saw some mapping from Rybar of some of the recent Russian missile attacks, some Oryx missiles reportedly, on Odessa. Now, these missiles flew across Crimea, Kherson, up past Mykolaiv, so sort of northeast of Odessa, past Odessa, and then turned around and came back and attacked Odessa from the back. So you would imagine that you normally would have your air defense pointing forward towards your enemy. And I'm not an air defense specialist or expert, of course, but that would be your general thinking, I guess. You would target your air defense to be scanning and looking where you think you're most likely to be attacked. So as you see some missiles go whizzing past over one's shoulder over that way, you think, oh, phew, we're safe. They're off to hit some target over there. But no, in this case, they turned around and then came and approached Odessa and struck from behind, where quite likely the air defense wasn't looking or wasn't as prepared, and hence they had a greater chance of succeeding and hitting in Odessa. And we have seen that there has been extensive damage done to Odessa just recently. Now, moving on to Odessa and the Black Sea and some updates there. Again, giving credit to Simplicus the Thinker here on some of this that I'll speak about. Just an update on some of the strikes on the Russian Navy. So the Olenogorski Gonyak, which was struck some month or 6 weeks ago, it was hit by a surface or semi-submersible Ukrainian drone. On one of the reports I did back then, we showed some footage of that taken from the drone of it approaching the Olenogorski, and it did significant damage. It seemed it did enough to have the ship listing, and it needed to be towed back into port. Reportedly, now it is back in action. It has been repaired within that 4 to 6 week period very rapidly and is now operational again. So while that attack had good PR impact for the Ukrainians, it appears as though in terms of military terms, it was not overly successful. It was not able to sink and destroy this ship, and within a 4 to 6 week period, it's now back operational again. Similarly, looking at the damages sustained by the Kilo class Rostov-on-Don submarine that were hit last month in September. And the landing ship, the Minsk. So there were two that were in the dry dock areas there, and they were struck by missiles. Now, reportedly, the submarine, the Rostov-on-Don, a report from the TASS news agency has said the submarine has minor damage that did not affect its robust hull. Eliminating them can only slightly increase the time the submarine is undergoing scheduled repairs. So the submarine was already in there for scheduled repairs, so it wasn't active on duty. It appears to, at this stage, and this is if we trust this reporting, have suffered only minor damage, which won't extensively add to the time that it would already have been out of the water undergoing its scheduled repairs. Reportedly, there is an assessment of the extent of the damage to the large landing ship, the Minsk, which is also struck at that time. Now, why are we seeing this this uptick on Ukrainian strikes in Crimea? If you recall, there was a pause there for some time where we didn't see a great deal or hear of a great deal in this area. At that time, I commented after listening to Military Summary Channel, because he had mentioned that there had been some reports that Zelensky had travelled to Snake Island and that we would probably see some activity there. And then a few weeks later, we did start to see some activity picking up in that area. There was some Russian bombing of Snake Island, and then the Ukrainian attacks on Crimea began. Now, reportedly, just this week there was a transport boat, the Puma, which has left the port of Odessa. Now, it left the port of Odessa accompanied by 2 Ukrainian naval ships and reportedly a MiG-29 providing some sort of air patrol and air cover. So it travelled from the Odessa ports, headed down past Romania, and was on its way to the Bosphorus. Now, at that time, there were 2 Russian patrol boats, the Vasily Baikov and the Sergei Kotov, in the area. Reportedly, 14 drone boats were launched at those two patrol boats. Those 2 patrol boats were then able to destroy them. One may have suffered some damage, but they were forced out of the area. They retreated out of the area due to the drone attacks, and this then allowed the Puma to travel down to the Bosphorus. So why are the Ukrainians doing this? It's about the grain. So, as we've said many times on this channel, the grain has played a large role in this conflict. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, of which Russia decided not to extend again, meant that Ukraine could no longer export its grain via the Black Sea. Ukraine has troubles exporting grain over land, with Poland and Hungary and Slovakia rejecting to buy Ukrainian grain because it's impacting their local domestic producers, and also for a period of time were rejecting to allow it to travel through their borders. So Ukraine has troubles shipping grain over land. They really want to be able to ship it via sea. Shipping it via sea, they can take larger loads and it's easier, it's cheaper for them to do that, and they get revenue for this. If they can sell this grain, they can get revenue. Now, they need revenue. So much so that the Ukrainians have set up an insurance fund of reportedly about $500 million, $500 million, to provide insurance to entice tankers and grain freighters to run the risk of getting themselves through the Bosphorus up to an Odessa port to be able to be loaded with grain and then get out again. And the reason that they're doing this and need this revenue is because they're having funding problems. So, from multiple points, Joseph Borrell, who is the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy, he has said during a meeting of representatives of the EU Foreign Ministry in Kiev that the EU foreign ministers have not reached an agreement on the allocation of assistance to Ukraine for the amount of 5 billion euros in 2024. Now, this is interesting because I may have misread or misinterpreted something a week or a fortnight ago about this, where I believe that Borrell had said that the EU will commit to providing these 5 billion euros to Ukraine in 2024. Now, we're getting the talk that it hasn't been agreed upon on that allocation of assistance. So again, we're just seeing things starting to be wound back, aid starting to slow down. He has said, "I hope that we will be able to reach an agreement by the end of this year during the negotiation of amendments to the EU multi-year budget." Now, also, the US did not provide any funding to Zelensky in his latest trip to Washington. In the government's, this is according to the Wall Street Journal, the US military, the department, the Pentagon, currently has $5.2 billion allocated for supplying the armed forces of Ukraine with weapons and ammunition and military aid. So, this amount represents the remaining funds that have been approved by the US authorities a year ago to support Ukraine. So, with the current government shutdown in the US, which has just been avoided the last hour, where a 45-day extension has been put in place. That 45-day extension does not include additional funding for Ukraine. Now, that's not to say that there won't be more coming after 45 days, but right now, there isn't any. So Ukraine is running on the funds that they were granted last year by the US. Now, that 5.2 billion at the current rate of supply is expected to last for approximately 6 months. So that's October, November, December, January, February, March. So that would run through until March. Now, while there won't obviously be an immediate halt in supplies, but if the delay extends for longer than 45 days, then future planning starts to become problematic. The Ukrainians begin to get worried. They can't guarantee, the government in Ukraine gets worried. They can't guarantee that they can start to pay for all the things that they're currently paying for with American funding. And this is a whole range of things I've mentioned before. There's subsidies being given to small businesses. There's the salary payment for first responders. There's payment for a wide range of things. US money and EU money is what's keeping the Ukrainian government going at the moment. Now, if that money dries up and suddenly all the public servants stop, again, there'll be a future further exodus to Europe. It's been mentioned today that the Ukrainian population now is down from 36 million prior to the start of the war to 23 million people. Many of those people have fled to Europe. Many of them would be unlikely to return for many, many years if they will at all. If the government shuts down, all of those public servants then will be unlikely to find any other work, and some of those will also be looking to leave. There are still talk, though, of F-16s. So that, there are, it's not as though everything's going to stop immediately, but there are still, there's talks of tanks, Abrams arriving. There's some reports that they may have arrived now. The first batch of 10 may be there. And F-16s, training, English language sessions are happening with Ukrainian pilots, and some planes are getting ready. Just an interesting note on the F-16s. The F-16s had their first flight in 1974. They're nearly as old as I am. Compare this to the Russian, the Su-35. The Su-35 had its first flight in 1988. So the Su-35 is 14 years younger than the F-16. The Su-30 had its first flight in 1992. So it's 18 years, it's nearly 20 years younger than the F-16. And the MiG-35 had its first flight in 2016. So it's a full 42 years younger than the F-16. Now, you might say, well, that's not an apples with apples comparison, because the F-35s, the American F-35s are far newer. Yes, but there's no talk of F-35s being involved in this conflict. All the talk is of F-16s being provided. Now, in this conflict, the Russians are capable of using everything. MiG-35s, Su-30s, Su-35s, the whole lot. All of these far younger, far more advanced, far more capable fighter aircraft. Now, the F-16s, of course, they have been upgraded, but they still have some of the core limitations of their airframe and of that 1960s era, 1970s era design that built them back then for their first flight in 1974. Whereas the MiG-35 first flight in 2016 is a new aircraft, and these aircraft will outmatch the F-16s when they get to Ukraine, if they get to Ukraine before this conflict in some way ends, or the US finds some excuse to not to deploy them. And that's a possibility. It's a real possibility. If Ukraine find themselves in a position where they are being beaten so badly, this offensive has failed, they're unable to build defensive lines sufficient to stop a Russian offensive, and by all indications a Russian offensive is growing, then they may find themselves being overrun. And when that happens, the Americans may just pull the pin on the F-16s and say, look, it's not worth it. Why would we get some F-16s in there just to get them shot down and be bad press and make it more difficult for us to sell them? So we may never see F-16s in this conflict. Continuing with the bad news in terms of support for Ukraine. So the Slovakia has had its elections, and ex-Prime Minister Robert Fico is now Prime Minister again. Well, he has been invited to form a coalition. His party, the Smer Party, received 23% of the vote in the election, and he will now likely form a coalition with the Hlas Party, which gained 15% of the vote. And the Hlas Party were an ex-wing of Fico's previous party. His previous party, they split off. And so we can look at this perhaps as a recombination in the coalition of the two of them. And that will give them 38% of the vote. They are likely to form a coalition with the Slovak National Party, the SNS, which scored 5.6% of the vote. That coalition would then have a ruling majority of 79 out of the 150 seats. Pardon me. The Liberal Pro-Western Progressive Slovakia Party gained 18% of the vote, and they have said that if Fico is unable to form a coalition, that they will attempt to form one. However, it seems very likely that Fico, given his previous, the wing of his previous party, have got 15%, that they will form a coalition, and then he just needs that small Slovak National Party to join. And them, as a small party, will most likely say yes if they're offered that chance to rule. So it looks like Slovakia will come back under the rule of Prime Minister Robert Fico, and he has reiterated that while he supports continued humanitarian and reconstruction aid to Ukraine, he is against sending any more arms. So this now puts Hungary, who has been against implementing sanctions and supporting providing arms to Ukraine. Hungary, Slovakia, not going to be providing any more arms. Poland, who has announced that it's not providing any more arms just in the last week. France, the ambassador there in Kiev this week has said that they are going to pivot from providing arms to providing investment in infrastructure and industry to develop arms in Ukraine. That has its own risks. The US now slowing down, not jumping at the chance to provide another multi-billion-dollar package to Ukraine. Instead, it's been pushed out of their funding, and it got pushed out because there is no longer this unanimous support in the US to provide the Ukraine with funding in Congress. Now they're going to have to fight for it. And President Biden's administration is going to have to find other ways to get this funding through. And combined with that, the EU now, the $5 billion that looked like it was sort of guaranteed, now Borrell is suggesting, well, we might need till the end of the year just to figure out how we would actually get that $5 billion to you. Now, all of this creates great pressure on Zelensky and his administration. As I say, if the funding starts to dry up, or if people there start to get the impression that the funding is going to dry up, they start to get worried. And if they start to get worried about who's leading them, they start to look to shift who's leading them. Now, we spoke last week about the reports of Antony Blinken speaking to Zelensky, and reportedly what may have been part of that discussion was that if you do want continued funding from us, there are going to be some strings attached. And some of those strings were, you will hold elections, because it doesn't look good in the US if we're giving all our money to a supposedly democratic country and you're suddenly saying you can't hold elections. So they will hold elections. Now, for Zelensky, that's not good. From many accounts, his likelihood of winning an election in Ukraine at this stage is slim to zero. There is no real reporting out there indicating that he would cruise through an election at this stage. And this is clearly one of the reasons why he's trying to push it back and retain power by not having to go into an election. Now, the US are saying we want an election, and this is very likely because the US also wants Zelensky out. He's run his race. They don't see value in him anymore. He wasn't able to deliver in terms of the offensive, and so now they'll look to put someone else in. Now, some of this speculation around that reasoning was also because the US don't believe that the Russians will negotiate with Zelensky, even as a figurehead leading the negotiations for the Americans, and instead they may need to install someone else there who the Russians have some faith that they may be able to negotiate with. So all of these things are very tough for Zelensky, and combined with the reports from the battlefield of these Russian counteroffensives starting, with the knowledge that the Russians by stealth are mobilizing 10 to 15,000 volunteers a week. We've had a report from Dmitry Medvedev that the 350,000 contracts have been signed this year, from the 1st of January until the end of September this year, with the Ministry of Defense. So the Russians are amassing a great force of volunteers. The Ukrainians, there are reports, I haven't called them out in detail here because I haven't had an opportunity to try to verify them further, but reports that the Ukrainian government is looking at putting a bill in place that would raise the maximum fighting age for men from where it is today considerably higher. Now, if that is true, then that's a terrible sign. If you're raising the age of your fighting men up into the 60s and beyond, if that is the case, that is a sure sign that you are struggling. On that topic too, Ben Wallace, ex-UK Defence Minister, he's just recently retired. He's written an article, and I honestly, it boggles the mind as to just seemingly how far out of touch with reality he is. His title's something along the lines of Ukraine's winning, but we've got to keep going. It's like, I'm not sure where he's getting this impression from. However, he also then says something along the lines of, while the average age of men fighting in Ukraine is now over 40, and he believes this is because President Zelensky is trying to protect the youth for the future. Well, actually, those youth should enlist and should start fighting for Ukraine. So here we have an ex-British politician telling the youth of Ukraine that they should get out in the front line and fight for him. I'm not sure what his thinking is. It's callous. The other thing is that he completely misses the point as to what has actually happened in terms of the average age. The average age of the Ukrainians being over the age of 40 isn't due to President Zelensky attempting to protect anyone. It's because those young men have been killed. Alexander Mercouris spoke about this on his show this morning. He mentioned that from memory, in September of last year, so a year ago, the average age of the frontline soldier in Ukraine was 27. Now it's reportedly over 40. That's a considerable shift in a year. And that means that the bulk of your real fighting force has been decimated and is unable to fight. And you are now pushing out to older men, men with families, men who would not normally volunteer, to get them to fight. And again, this is another big difference. If you are conscripting people and forcing people off the street to fight, their willingness and commitment to fight when they reach the front line is completely different to the level of willingness and commitment from people who volunteer to go and fight. Now, of course, some people who volunteer will get there and realise, hang on, this isn't the romantic war I thought, I'd like to be out of here, certainly. But some of them will volunteer and will go there and fight and are committed to the fighting. Very few of those who are dragged into the fighting will be so committed. And that also is a problem in terms of morale and how a conflict will go for Ukraine in the coming months. Now, just moving to the battle update over the last 24 hours, and this is, as usual, taking from the Russian Ministry of Defense reporting. Starting up in the Kupiansk region, up in the northern region of the main front line, where the Zapad group of forces are operational. Heavy flamethrowers, the TOS-1, the assault spec systems have been used again. I saw some footage of that today. Those thermobaric weapons really are frightening to see. I cannot imagine what it must be like to be anywhere near one of those when they go off. Just the lingering fireball effect, the vacuum effect they have, and the concussive shock that they deliver is just truly frightening. Interestingly, we see here the numbers in the Kupiansk region, that reportedly 65 Ukrainian servicemen lost, 2 motor vehicles, 1 Paladin howitzer and 1 M777. This is consistent with what we've seen over the last couple of weeks there. We did have some reporting of some Russian advances around Sinkovka, up at the top of that area there. Not a great deal of reports from the Ministry of Defense of Ukrainian attacks in that area. Moving down a little down the line to Krasny Liman area, this is where the centre group of forces operate, again reportedly using the heavy flamethrower systems. They've repelled 2 attacks of assault groups, and the enemy losses reported there have amounted to 60 Ukrainian servicemen. So again, on the northern line, activities sort of similar as it has been over the last week or so. The enemy losses have amounted to 60 Ukrainian servicemen, 1 Aketsia self-propelled artillery system, 1 D-20 howitzer, and 1 D-30 howitzer has been struck. Now, moving to Donetsk region, where the Yug group of forces operating, here we can really see the sort of slowdown in activity. There are only reports of 3 attacks of the armed forces of Ukraine, that being the 110th Mechanised, the 59th Mechanised Infantry, and the 5th Assault Brigades, close to Krasnogorovka, Andreevka, and Nevelskoye. So, in other areas in the Donetsk region, where around Kleshchievka, Avdiivka, where we have had previously a large number of reported attacks, we don't see that today. Also, the enemy losses in this area are a number of 180 reported killed and wounded. Now, 180 men killed and wounded, don't get me wrong, is a large number to happen in a day, but this is not of the scale that we have seen in the past weeks, where the numbers in this area around Donetsk have reached up into the 400 some days, 430 some days reportedly lost. So we do, again, in this heavy fighting area here, seem to be seeing a slowing down in the Ukrainian offensive. Moving to the South Donetsk region, where the Vostok group of forces are operating, 1 attack reportedly repelled by the 128th Territorial Defence Brigade close to Pryutny. And as I mentioned before, around the area, Pryutny, Urozhanoye, that area there are reports of Russian counteroffensives in those area, where previously we've had Ukrainian attacks being reported. Now that number is dropping. In the South Donetsk region, reportedly 30 Ukrainian servicemen have been killed or wounded in the last 24 hours. 2 pickup trucks, 1 M777 artillery system, and 1 D-20 howitzer system. Now, in Zaporozhye, in this area here, reports that ground attack aviation and helicopters have been operating. No reports of Ukrainian attacks being repelled. Instead, just reports of manpower and hardware being struck from the AFU's 47th, 65th, 117th, 118th Mechanized Brigades near Rabotno, Malaya Tokmacha, Novodarovka, and Verbovoy. So the heavy fighting that has been going on from Oerkhovo down to Robotne, or Rabotino, and Verbovoy. Again, it seems as though the tide is turning here, and the Russians are now gaining the upper hand. And there were some reports just before I was going live and recording this, that there are some strongholds around these areas which the Russians are now starting to claim back. Again, to give us an indication of the scale here, in Zaporozhye, 35 Ukrainian servicemen reported killed and wounded. And these servicemen numbers are reportedly not calculated by the Russian Ministry of Defense. They are intercepted by the Russian Ministry of Defense, where Ukrainian reports of their losses are intercepted, and that's how the Ministry of Defense gets these numbers. In the Zaporozhye region, 2 armoured fighting vehicles, including a Bradley infantry fighting vehicle, and 3 motor vehicles were eliminated. Now, the counter-battery warfare has still been going on in this area, and due to that counter-battery warfare, 1 Gvozdika self-propelled artillery system, 1 M46 gun, 1 D-30 howitzer, as well as another ANTPQ counter-battery warfare radar was eliminated. Now, again, losing these counter-battery warfare radar, as I've said before, is really devastating to your artillery's capability to fight in counter-battery artillery battles. If you don't have opposition artillery there firing at you, you don't really need these radars. You can just find your targets and shoot at them with your artillery. However, once your enemy artillery turns up, one of the first things they're going to do is try and take you out. And this is where you want these counter-battery radars, because they allow you to track the incoming shells from your enemy's artillery, and then trace back to locate where they are so you can fire back at them. So again, the Ukrainians reportedly have lost another one of these today. Then moving down the Kherson direction. During the day, up to 30 Ukrainian servicemen, 2 motor vehicles were destroyed. Now, this number of 30 around the Kherson region, yeah, we've seen elevated numbers. It definitely does feel as though there has been some build-up of Ukrainian troops around the Kherson region. There doesn't seem to have been a push to get across the Dnieper River into the area held by the Russians, but the casualty numbers have seemed to be ticking up from 15 to 30 to 50 to 30, around there. Now, this, as I was saying before, seems to be due to a Russian awareness of some sort of a build-up there and increased activity by the Russians across the Dnieper, not in terms of Russian men and infantry across the Dnieper, but bomb, missile and artillery shelling across the Dnieper at concentrations of manpower and ammunition dumps and that sort of thing in that Kherson region. So that's sort of the battle update. Now, just to finish off here, Dmitry Medvedev, who's an ex-prime minister of Russia, ex-president of Russia. He is the deputy head of the Security Council in Russia. He has spoken about the special military operation continuing until the Nazi Kiev regime is completely destroyed and the original Russian territories are liberated from the enemy. And victory will be ours. And there will be more new regions within Russia. And so the term Novorossiya has started to be mentioned a little more frequently. Now, Novorossiya is a historical name which referred to the southern area of Ukraine. So the area north of the Black Sea, Crimea, Kherson, Lugansk, Donetsk, those sort of areas. So the areas which the Russians have control over at the moment, Crimea, areas of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Lugansk, Donetsk, those areas. However, what I think Dmitry Medvedev is getting to here is that concept of Novorossiya is going to be pursued. And so that would lead to Odessa, right up to Moldova, so that Transnistria, that Russian enclave, Russian separatist enclave there, can be joined to Russia. All of Zaporozhye region to the Dnieper at least. The Kherson region, the Lugansk, Donetsk regions, the Kharkiv region. And as we've said, with those interesting videos that came out of the Ministry of Defense over the last week, one seeming to indicate that Kiev is the target, the other that Odessa is a target, Odessa obviously, but Kiev, which would mean then that the push would go right up, as I've suggested before, kind of in some ways makes logical sense to drive all the way west to the Dnieper River up to Kiev and follow the Dnieper River down and perhaps set the Dnieper as a border. Everything to the east becomes part of Russia. Everything to the west remains as Ukraine in whatever form it may take. After, if the Russians were to reach that point. That's for the Ukraine update. That's about it. One last little note here, just an update around Armenia, Azerbaijan, and what's happening in the Nagorno-Karabakh area there. Certainly, Nikol Pashinyan, the Prime Minister of Armenia, seems to be working towards separating Armenia from its traditional ties with Russia and align itself with the West. There is talk of Russian TV channel broadcasts being cancelled in Armenia, and this comes after Armenia engaged in joint military exercises, the Eagle Partner exercises, with the US military, while at the same time failing to host the CSTO, which is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, military exercises. The CSTO is an intergovernmental military alliance which consists of 6 post-Soviet states of Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan and Russia. So Armenia, part of that grouping of post-Soviet states, previously friendly with Russia, previously Russia actually providing security sort of guarantees over the Nagorno-Karabakh area and friendly with Armenia. However, Pashinyan now stepping away from that, cutting off Russian TV, if that reporting is true, certainly engaging in the Eagle Partner military exercises with the United States and failing to host the Collective Security Treaty Organization military exercises. Now, as I say, this is an interesting strategy for Pashinyan. He may get American support. The Americans, I guess, would love to have a military base in that area, but that's going to cause conflict. You look what's happened to Ukraine, where Ukraine has had American bases in there and got too close to Russia, and Russia has perceived them as a threat of joining NATO. If that sort of thing were to happen with Armenia, it would be far easier for Russia to influence what happens in Armenia than it is on a much larger and well-armed Ukraine, at least well-armed at the start of this conflict. So Armenia still ongoing. Another area for us to keep an eye on is Serbia. That conflict around Kosovo is still bubbling away. Depending on what happens over the coming months with the Ukrainian conflict, with the likes of nations like Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, perhaps moving away from support for Ukraine, perhaps, depending on their elections, becoming far more aligned and friendly with Russia. Serbia may then, if it feels it has some support in its region around it, may also grow in its confidence around how it wants to address the Kosovo situation. All right, that's it for tonight. Thank you very much. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please subscribe, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.